Hey everyone, in this guide I'll be giving you all the information you need to know in order to improve your mechanics in League of Legends. We'll be going over various mechanical techniques, ways to improve your raw inputs such as mouse accuracy and mouse speed, talking about some advanced mechanics such as predicting movement and tethering, and finally some general thoughts about mechanics. As always, everything is timestamped below, so let's get started. Let's start our mechanical techniques off with clicking. So in clicking, there's three things that are really important. The first is how close you click to your character. So clicking close to your character allows you to change directions quicker and it increases responsiveness. So this is super important for a couple reasons. First off, obviously, if you're dodging skill shots and stuff like that, changing directions more often is much better for making your movement harder to predict. And also, especially if you don't click particularly fast, it can be problematic because if you click at such long distances, you will walk a fair amount of distance in the direction before you actually change again. Whereas if you click closer to your target, this distance is much smaller. So this is really important, especially if you're in a skill shot heavy matchup, which is why especially high level mid laners are extremely good at this. So clicking close to your character is really important. Next, how quickly you can click and spamming clicks in general is really important. So as we said before, if you have kind of these longer times between clicks, either because your mouse speed is slow or you're just like clicking at these long distances away from your character, it becomes really easy to predict your movement. So if you can spam a lot of clicks in combination with close to your champion, it becomes a lot easier for you to kind of like vary your movement, and it becomes way harder for your opponent to deal with you, and your movement kind of becomes inherently random. So this is really crucial to having good movement, is just like being able to click really quickly, either between 2 points or in a circle around you, and that'll help vary your movement a lot. Lastly, we have your clicking accuracy. So the reality is, if you're clicking really fast, if you're moving around a lot, your skill shot accuracy is probably going to suffer, especially if you're really trying to maximize the most out of your movement and aiming skill shots at the same time. However, it's really important you get good at this, because there are many champions in this game that are balanced around having a difficult to hit skill shot. So if you think of champions like Syndra that are very skill shot reliant, or champions like Xerath or Zoe or something like that, typically these champions aren't that good in low elo because players just don't hit enough skill shots on them. And this is really important because it's one of those like invisible things that isn't really tracked over the game. You know, I don't think anyone tracks like what percentage of skill shots you hit over the game. But I think if this was tracked, you would see a massive difference between the amount of skill shots, say, a low elo Syndra hits, a high elo Syndra hits, and like a pro player Syndra hits. So there's a really big difference there. So kind of like mouse accuracy or your skill shot clicking accuracy is the final thing that's really important for clicking. So let me show you some examples of when clicking is really important. So here, Syndra vs Orianna matchup against Coach Curtis, and just pay really close attention to my cursor and how active it is, and how you can use your movement just like constantly changing directions to dodge not all but most of Syndra's skill shots. So you'll see here, so far I've just been very active with my movement, constantly changing directions, and it just makes it like so much more difficult for people to hit skill shots on you. And this is kind of like what high level laning in these like mage vs mage matchups is all about, is just like constantly, you know, changing directions, having your clicks like be very accurate, and stuff like that. So this is really important, and I think that Syndra vs Ori is probably like the best example of a matchup like this. There are many matchups that are kind of like one-sided, as in one person has to dodge skill shots but the other person doesn't, and I will show one of these in a second. But Syndra vs Ori is one where both players need to dodge skill shots extremely well. So our second example, this time a melee versus range matchup. So you'll find this is very common if you play champions like Sylas, Yone, Akali. If you have poor movement in the early game, you'll have a very hard time dealing with these kind of lane bullies. So you'll see kind of clicking back and forth, just trying to make it as difficult as possible for Syndra to hit her abilities on me. And this makes a really big difference, because a lot of these champions, they're very mana reliant, and if you can waste their mana by, you know, having good movement and you don't reach that point to where you can get all in, it really rewards your mechanics and you get a free lane, basically. Another super obvious example of when clicking is important is whenever you're kiting. So if you're playing an ADC, or if you're playing a champion like Cassio, you should be inputting movement commands in between every either auto attack, or in Cassio's case, every E on your opponent. So you'll see if you slow this down, that in between every E I put on this Urgot, I actually click, and that's so that you can maximize your movement while you're on cooldown, either with your auto attack animation or with, in Cassio's case, your E cooldown. So For that kind of stuff, having fast and accurate clicks is also extremely important. Next up is key presses and ability use. If you do have trouble pressing keys either quickly or in sequences, the best bet for you is just to practice your combos in Practice Tool. For the most part, I don't think people struggle with this as nearly as much as they do with the mouse, but it's still pretty important. Smart casting is also extremely important, and I'm of the opinion that almost every ability in the game should be smart casted, although there are a few exceptions where maybe more precision is needed. One thing you can also do is rebinding keys to make things easier for yourself and take less inputs. For example, you can bind attack, move, click to a single key so that only requires one input instead of two, and one thing I've done personally is to bind my F keys to extra keys on my mouse so I don't have to take my left hand away from my abilities and I can still move my mouse while also using F keys. For how to actually use your abilities, personally I think this falls more under skirmishing or champion knowledge, but a lot of people still consider it to be mechanics, so I'm going to talk about it anyway. I'm going to read you this quote from The Shy because people think of him as a really mechanical player. So The Shy said, "People say I'm a mechanical player, but I feel, because I already have the idea planned out, I'm more of a theory player. I have it all crafted out in my mind, but I get that the fans see that as mechanical. But it's more than just mechanics, it's more tactical thoughts." So that was really eye-opening to me when I read it, because I think people consider The Shy to be one of the most mechanical players on the planet, and he thinks that it's more just tactical thoughts, as he said. So I think whenever you're playing a 1v1, skirmish, or teamfight, it's a lot easier to play out if you're expecting things or you've planned things ahead, as opposed to simply reacting with your abilities in the moment. Of course, no matter how good you are, you always have to react at least somewhat, but a lot of the time what people see as extremely high-level mechanics is, in my opinion, instead extremely high-level game knowledge with complete awareness of how the fight will play out and how best to use your abilities at any given moment. Tethering is when you want to maintain a fixed distance away from the enemy champion. This will simultaneously allow you safety from their abilities, but also allows you to harass on your maximum range. You can imagine this as a physical tether between your two champions that you want to keep at the same length, or imagine it as two sets of lines that are moving back and forth but remain the same distance apart. So essentially, you want to play at your maximum range where you can harass your opponent, so this will typically be the range of your spells or your auto attack depending on what champion you're playing, while also remaining out of range of your opponent as not to take any damage. So if we use Syndra as an example, Syndra's kind of tether range is typically going to be her Q. And now, it's kind of interesting because as you can see, Syndra's Q only reaches to this line here, but you can actually still harass this target even though you're out of it. And that's because circle skill shots, if you place them at the end of it, the circle goes beyond the actual spell range. So for Syndra, you'd be looking to keep this kind of distance. If your opponent moves forward, you would want to move back by the same kind of by the same amount that they move forward. If they move backwards, you would want to chase them. Essentially, you just want to maintain that fixed distance the whole time. Now, it could be different if you're versus a melee champion. So against melee champions, you might instead be playing around your auto attack range. So if your auto attack range is here, whenever you auto-attack someone, they're most likely, especially if they're a melee champion, going to want to move forward to punish you. So in those kind of situations, most likely you would auto-attack and then immediately move back to maintain that distance between you. As you can see in this example, the idea is to use accurate and fast clicks to constantly readjust to your opponent's movements. This is in order to maintain safety while also harassing your opponent. Doing this to a high level is very, very difficult because if you make a mistake, you will either take free damage or just straight up die. But it's absolutely essential for abusing matchups, especially as a ranged champion. Range in general is extremely important and is something you should think about all throughout the games. Too many times when I'm coaching people, I see them not play to their range and end up in melee range and taking too much damage for free and not playing to their champion's strengths. Predicting where people will move and when they will throw their skill shots is a skill that takes a lot of time to improve on and will come a lot easier with experience, but there's definitely some things to look out for. So when you're dodging skill shots, the things to keep in mind the most are to keep your movement extremely active and try not to fall into some sort of pattern. If your movement is random, then inherently it's going to be very difficult for your opponent to predict what you're going to do. It's also good to keep in mind that your opponent will normally harass at set times. For example, when you go to CS a creep or when you walk into their maximum range. You can use this to bait out skill shots, and this is why it's so important for you to be aggressive with your movement, because coming back to reacting versus predicting that we talked about earlier, if you're the one forcing your opponent to use abilities, it's much easier to dodge them because you know they're coming. Your positioning when dodging skill shots is important in both laning phase and in teamfighting, so make sure you leave a lot of space for yourself to play in, because if you end up in corridors or with limited areas to dodge in, they have a very high chance of hitting skill shots on you. Hitting skill shots can be made easier in several ways. There are often times where your opponent is much easier to hit with a skill shot, such as when they're going for a last hit, which locks them in an auto attack animation, or when they walk forward and they have no choice but to walk backwards or otherwise take an auto attack. Lastly, there are some times when you may want to hold your skill shots for a short period of time before using them. One thing to keep in mind is that while you still hold the skill shot, it creates pressure because your opponent has to move in a way to dodge it. During this time, you can often get auto attacks for free while your opponent slowly jukes themselves to death. This is super common on a champion like LeBlanc because when you dash into people, they will almost instantly begin to dodge left and right in order to not get hit by the chain. If you just auto attack a couple times and then throw your chain straight ahead, they almost always get hit by it. With all the mechanical techniques out of the way, let's talk about how you actually improve your input, stuff like mouse accuracy, speed, APM, etc. So the first and most obvious is just to play the game. And the reason this is good is because you can naturally improve your mechanics while you're learning your other fundamentals. You can be focusing on something like laning, and as long as you're playing the game a fair amount, your mechanics will naturally be improving. That being said, you can make this more efficient by playing champions that reward a certain mechanic. So for example, if you really want to improve on your skill shots, you may want to play a champion that rewards skill shots or is very skill shot demanding, a champion like Zoe, Syndra, champions like that, where your success on the champion is pretty much directly correlated to how many skill shots you're going to hit. There's various types of stuff you can do with this, so there are lots of champs that kite. There's some that have like a high amount of APM where you need to press like a lot of buttons in a short amount of time, or you might need to stay like really active like with your skills, like very short cooldowns. You might also have like very combo heavy champions. And finally, there are some champions that really reward movement. Again, especially those melee champions when you're playing into those, I'd say melee champions that are weak in the early game, playing into strong laners really reward movement. So if you play those sort of champions, you can kind of accelerate your mechanics learning like that. Like any other fundamental, if you isolate mechanics as a fundamental, you can improve it quicker than if you just kind of try and improve it passively. So for that, there are a lot of external tools that you can use. So LoL Dodge Game has a lot of mini games that you can play, stuff like dodging, hitting skill shots. I would just go on there and check out all the mini games. I think they've got a really good setup. I'll link that in the description. So there's a lot of interesting stuff to check out there. There's also, if you wanted to go really hardcore with it, there's like aim trainers like Kovacs, for example. I play a fair amount of Kovacs, but I mainly play that for Apex. I never played it for League of Legends. But there's a lot of useful stuff in there. There's a lot of scenarios on there that will train your mouse speed, your mouse accuracy, and stuff like that. And that's really like, if you want to take this super seriously, I would say that is probably the way to do it. If you just want something to do in queue, I would say Aim Booster is a good alternative, and also it has the added bonus of being free. So I really like Aim Booster as well. So there's a lot of different ways of, if you do want to isolate mechanics, like you purely want to work on mechanics, there's a lot of tools there either in-game or out of game for you to do it. Finally, if you do choose to isolate your mechanics, if you are looking to focus on that fundamental, just improving your mechanics, the first thing I would improve on is your APM. So Outplayed has a great APM tracker that you can turn on. And the reason I think APM is good to start with is because there's a lot of periods in the game where there is some downtime, but if you kind of just need to keep your APM up at all times, because if you go from playing like a snail, it's very difficult to like raise that speed for the moments where you really have to kind of just play really fast, right? So I think like doing stuff throughout the game, keeping your APM up, kind of keeping your hands busy is really good for staying kind of on top of your mechanics all throughout the game. There's pretty much always stuff that you can be doing that's useful with your APM. You can just like be spamming clicks in the lane, making your movement difficult. You can start using F keys. You could even tab spam, which is sometimes useful, but if you're not actually gathering the information from it, might not be that useful. But just in general, I would say APM, just as a whole, is not the most important in League, but it's a really good starting point, because if you don't have the required APM, it can be very difficult to actually execute on the mechanical techniques, even if you know what they are. I want to finish this video off with general discussion on a couple of things, because I feel like I'm going to get asked a lot of questions about it. So the first off is the importance of mechanics in League. In my opinion, mechanics aren't super important in League, but they're basically as important as you want them to be, and they're somewhat role and champion dependent as well. So if you're someone that wants to play like the laning phase really aggressively, you play mechanically intensive champions, you're really trying to get the most out of like every skirmish and that, then mechanics for you are going to be very, very important. But it's like completely possible and also completely fine to reach Challenger in a completely different way. Someone that is playing for a more like strategical game is someone that maybe mains like support or something. It's going to have a very different level of mechanics required compared to someone that mains ADC, right? That's pretty straightforward. So I think compared to a lot of other games, League has a low mechanics requirement. At least from the other games I've played to a fairly high level, being StarCraft and Apex, both of those games have a pretty high mechanical requirement. But I would say League actually has a much lower mechanical requirement, but you can still get a lot out of mechanics if you kind of want to get a lot out of it. If you play towards those mechanical strengths, it's like you can really get an edge out of your opponent. It matters a lot, and especially at a pro level, mechanics sometimes become the difference between these players that are playing at such a high level already. But if we're just talking about reaching Challenger, you don't need good mechanics to reach Challenger, although it's certainly a lot easier if you do have them. Another thing I want to quickly talk about is talent versus effort. So I think a lot of people will say that, well, they just don't have the mechanics, as in they don't have the talent in order to reach, whatever rank, whether that's Diamond or Platinum or Challenger or whatever it is. But I think that first off, the mechanical skill is very trainable. I think that stuff like mouse accuracy and speed, it's for the most part not talent, and it's going to be the kind of level of effort that you put into it. Now, that being said, at a very high level, I think there definitely is talent to it. If you want mechanics on the level of someone like Rookie or Chovy, I don't think everyone can achieve that level. But the kind of level of mechanical skill to reach Challenger, I think that's attainable for everyone. Even fairly high levels of mechanical skill, I feel like is attainable by anyone that's really looking to put in the effort. I just think that the kind of level that people are talking about where talent is like more important, that's like a level beyond like what most people will ever even need or want to reach. That being said, like if you are talented mechanically, you might find it a bit easier to achieve your mechanics, but I really think for the most part, like I don't like it when people just kind of self-defeat themselves before they even start. There's a lot of people who say like my mechanical skill will never be good or anything like that, and then they don't even try. And I think that's really problematic because, like I said, League, the mechanics aren't the be-all end-all. They are important, but they're not the be-all end-all. And secondly, the mechanics in League, they're not extremely complex, and a lot of it as well is like technique and stuff, right? So I really think, guys, no matter how bad you think you are mechanically, no matter what like talent you think you lack, I promise that you can achieve like mostly whatever mechanical level you want, no matter who or who you are, what age you are, anything like that. So the last thing I have to bring up is wrist problems. So if you're someone that is looking to like click a lot, have high APM, it's almost guaranteed that you will run into some kind of wrist problem if you don't do any form of stretching. So for me, I've never had wrist problems ever. And it's basically, at least the thing I think I owe it to, is I just do like a few stretches like every day. So I'll link you guys to the video that I watched for this. It really doesn't take long, literally like 2 or 3 minutes. You can do it in queue. You can literally do it at any time of day. And I just want to mention that because I feel like if I don't, there's some people that will have wrist problems as a result of like trying to click a lot faster, especially if like it's not something you gradually work up to, but you kind of play the game like sort of slowly right now, but you suddenly like try and increase it to a much larger level. So just keep that in mind, guys. Like there is kind of a little bit of maintenance. I don't want to like scare you guys with it because, like I said, I don't think it happens to most players, especially not pro players, unless you're playing a lot. But if you are someone, like I know some of you out there play this game actually more than I do now. And if you are looking to kind of like improve your mechanics a lot and, increase your speed and stuff like that, you will probably have a wrist problem come up at some point if you completely neglect doing any wrist exercises at all. So guys, that is going to be it for my guide to mechanics. I tried to make sure that everything you need is in this video. That being said, if you feel like I missed something, or if you have any questions still after the video, please leave them below. I'd be happy to answer your questions. Also guys, it did take me a fair amount of time to make this video, so I would appreciate if you go ahead and like and subscribe if you did like the video. But yeah, that'll be it for this one, guys. So I'll see you next time.